right? Especially in our Indian context, because SMEs are kind of like the backbone of our country, right? They are a big chunk and a major important sector of the economy altogether. So I decided to talk about that, why it matters to SMEs, and why they should consider it. So that's why I decided to talk about this a bit. So let's dive into it further. So I want to set the context, right? Next slide, please. Yeah, so the context, as we all know, the problem is climate change, right? And we are living through it, right? So our global economies, all the countries everywhere, either be it the developed ones or the developing ones, everybody's economy is highly reliant on fossil fuels for their growth, right? Either be it, for your energy requirements or your transportation or your manufacturing sector, some way or the other way, we all are reliant on fossil fuels, right? And they don't burn cleanly, right? So they emit a lot of greenhouse gases, predominantly carbon dioxide being the major thing. Apart from that, we also have methane, nitrous oxide, and whatnot, right? So this growth, what has happened is over this last 80, 100 odd years, it has increased the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, right? So we have seen a jump of 50% of ppm. So ppm is like particles per million molecules. So the number might not seem a very big number, because 420 particles per million of molecules of atmosphere doesn't sound a huge number, right? But they are very significant, as in they prevent the energy balance that happens between the earth and the sun, right? So they trap heat, and this heat makes our climate systems go different, right? Act different. So this has clearly impacted our temperature, first thing. So our average temperature over these last 80 odd years have gone up, by 1.3 degrees Celsius, right? And we really feel it, right? So our summers have become more warmer. We are more prone to heat waves now, and typically, nowadays our summers we can't spend without air conditions, right? It has become that hot. So temperature is the first thing, which is a very clear evidence of climate change. Next thing is the precipitation changes. So we are seeing news of heavy rains, flooding our major cities like Mumbai, Delhi. So this is happening all because of climate change, right? So our precipitation patterns, the pattern what we used to have for the last 20, 30 years, they're not the same, right? So, and unlike temperature, you can't really judge what's happening with precipitation, because some areas, the wetter areas tend to become more wetter, and the drier areas tend to become more drier. Apart from that, when it rains, rains everything at one go, right? So which is causing all this flooding and disrupting of our lives, right? And third, the sea level rises, right? As the temperature goes up, our glaciers melt and waters heat up. So hot water tends to occupy more volume, right? So the sea level rises are also going up. So the first three things, they are all chronic. They are all increasing at a slower rate. So it's all increasing, but they are happening at a slower rate. So even though we might not feel the pinch of it right now, we are going to feel it even more harder later on. But the fourth event, the extreme events, that's we are already feeling it a lot. Okay, so the question arises, right? Didn't we have extreme events 100 years ago? Yes, we did have. But the difference now is the climate change is exacerbating the extreme events, right? So whatever storm that we used to get earlier, the amount of rainfall the storm brought maybe 20 years ago is not same as what we have seen in the last 4 or 5 years ago, right? Our coastal cities are facing many storms. So extreme events have become a sort of a problem. So next, we have discussed the problems, right? So I want to put a perspective as to how these problems are impacting businesses, right? Like, let's put figures to this, because we see things in the news and we experience things, but let's see how it has impacted businesses around the world, right? So next slide, please. Yeah, so I have put some major incidents that have happened in the last decade and a half, right? So starting with the Thailand floods that we had, that Thailand had in the year 2011, and clearly their manufacturing sector went for a toss, right? The global supply chains of chips and car parts really took a hit. So the entire global production, kind of slowed down, and we saw downward trend during that year. And next we had the Australian bushfires. So that did not have a wider ramification like what we had for the floods, but still it was a big event, especially for the nation as a whole, Australia nation as a whole. Apart from that, their insurance sector, took a beating, right? Because they didn't expect companies and peoples to come and claim so much of of claims, right? It was unprecedented. They never expected this many insurers will come for and raise a claim, right? So they faced a lot of insured losses. And then a closer example that's closer to home would be the cyclone that Chennai had in the year 2023, where the lot of the automobile SMEs that are in and around Chennai, the Kanjipuram, Tiruvallur district, they faced a cumulative loss of to the tune of 11,000 crores as per the SME body. So these are all happen, and the road from now on does not look that great either, right? Because CDP stands for Carbon Disclosure Project. So they have made their own research on how what companies feel the things are going to be moving forward. So they have figured out that more than 8,000 suppliers feel that their revenues is at risk, right? More than a quarter and $1.25 trillion is at risk. And they also believe that there could be a premature asset write off to the tune of about $250 billion. So not everything is gloom and doom. They also think that climate related business opportunities could also turn up, which could be around the tune of $2 trillion, right? So these are the impacts that we are seeing, and these numbers are really huge, right? They're not small figures. And as we move forward, it is impacting us a lot. So the nations around the world has to take a step, right? We need to stay away from the worst effects of climate change, right? We are at the starting stages, and we are already seeing huge amount of losses, right? So moving forward, if we don't act quickly and if we don't make changes, we are going to see even more events, right? So next slide, please. So that's when the nations met together in 2015 for the conference of parties, and they decided that let's set a target, right? Because the science community really felt that if we don't really constrain our emissions and arrest this temperature change to 2 degrees Celsius before the end of century, we are like we are kind of in a doom situation. So that's when nations really took a step, and they decided that let's work against a target, let's work towards a target, sorry. So they decided that let's go for a target of keeping the temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, while also pursuing limits to the limits efforts to limit the temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? So why this distinction? Because it does not feel like a bigger jump, right? So 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees Celsius, it does not feel like a bigger jump, but it is a bigger jump because we so throughout at least for the most of human civilization, we have had a stable temperature, right? So we have had a very stable temperature on a grand scheme of things, considering the fact that Earth has had a lot of ice ages and a lot of destruction that has brought upon by meteors and etc. So our developments, our growth, everything has been throughout a phase that was supported by a stable climate. So all the climate models suggest that once we cross the 2 degree threshold, even the models is not able to predict how bad or what we can expect, right? That could be like a tipping point, right? So once we tip beyond that, we could be on an irrecoverable passage. So that's what they decided, and nations have come forward to set their own targets. So India has also set our own targets, right? So we have also said that uh, we'll give our own nationally determined contribution. So next slide, please. So this is India's targets, right? So our target, is to bring down our carbon intensity of our economy by 45% by 2030. And the next thing is to ensure that 50% of our electricity is from renewable energies, right? And we also have a net zero goal of 2070. So this does not really align with what the Paris Agreement says. But since India being a developing country, we can't really afford to put all our eggs in sustainability and climate change, at the cost or at the expense of development, right? So as a developing country, we are decided to take a bit slower. So that's why our net zero emission target is by 2070. So we can see that everywhere there's a clear trend, and so far we saw the effects of physical effects of climate change, right? And countries are trying to arrest that by transitioning into a low carbon economy, right? So this transition, right, this transition into low carbon economy creates a different sorts of problem, right? So this is where the entire decarbonization comes into picture, right? Because we all are so used to being in an economy, especially businesses, right, are used to run where we are heavily reliant on fossil fuels for everything, right? Like, so this transition is not going to be easy, so that gives us a lot of problems, right? So that's what we're going to look at next, what sort of risks that are going to come from this transition. So next slide please. Yeah, so I have put forward the transition risk that businesses face. So transition, the primary driver of transition risk comes from policy, because uh, as we saw previously, right, countries are moving towards a low carbon economy because that's in the best interest of all of us. So countries keep on changing their policies, right? They bring about new policies. They want to ensure that businesses do reduce their emissions, right? Do uh, attain certain levels of decarbonization, so that as a country as a whole they can attain reach their own targets too, right? So policy becomes the biggest driver of risk and transition risk. So I have put few examples in the Indian context. So our government is working towards bringing about a carbon trading scheme. It's like a cap and trade scheme where they're initially targeting the most nine energy intensive sectors, and they're going to set caps, right? So as a firm, you will have a certain amount of emission level that you can hit. So once you cross the threshold, you will be penalized for that. Or to avoid the penalty, you might want to buy some carbon credits from another person who's well below the limits, right? So that's what this carbon trading scheme is going to come. Probably they're going to roll out in the early next year sometime. So that's one example. So clearly, industry firms in the energy intensive industries, right? So they need to start worrying about it, right? Because they don't want to be the wrong end of things, where they have to see all this, complaints not being there, or where they have to pay penalty, right? Because that's not the core business, right? That's something added to your core business. So that's going to impact. And next is the cafe norm that's going to come for the auto industry, where the manufacturers are expected their the fleet, the amount of vehicle they sell, all put together, their average efficiency should be at a threshold, right? If you don't cross a threshold, so obviously you're going to get penalized, right? So in terms of your car prices is going to be priced a bit higher, right? So you're going to lose out your competitive edge. So this is what the cafe norms is all about. So if a manufacturer, who's in their usual trajectory of plans for their business, right, they might not have thought about it, right, unless and until they were very uh, proactive about it. So a rule like this comes up, so immediately manufacturers has to go back to the drawing boards, right? How to increase the efficiency of their models, right? Do they launch new products, or do they try a different fuel products? So all this comes into question. And again, we also have litigation suit. That litigation suits is not a really a big thing in India as of now. It's a Western thingy where the activists and environmentalists, if they see a company pursuing a project that is against the spirit of decarbonization, they're just going to file a case against it, okay? And if they win it, your project is in the bin, right? So policy and legal risk is going to be a major thing. And then let's proceed to technological risk. So our SMEs, especially the ones in the traditional sectors, right, we still use kind of outdated technologies, right? Be it our generators or be it the motors that we use, they're not very energy efficient, right? So because of that, when the new technology comes in, okay, so you're going to lose out, right? Yeah, so that could be a risk, right? So say, for example, tomorrow the government says, we are going to bring about a policy which kind of shuts down all the legacy assets, right? So that's a risk, right? Because you need to transition to a newer technology, a cleaner technology soon. And also, we as a country are trying, as we saw, our goal is to have 50% of our energy from renewables. So we are having a faster adoption of renewables. So this could technically, make the fossil fuel infrastructure unviable, right? Especially for the suppliers of in that sector, right? So unless and until you don't try to look at alternate businesses, you are at the verge of losing out, right? So that's the technology risk. And then finally, it's all what about the reputational risk and what the consumer is expecting out of you. So all these global MNCs, right? So they work out of multiple countries and they face flags when when they are questioned on an international stage why your partners are not doing this, right? So to do that, this global brands, they want their local partners, the supply chain partners, to step up, and get into the game of this, climate change, setting your own targets, right? So that's one thing. And then consumers, right, the people who buy your products, they are demanding more of sustainable products, right? So it can be clearly seen in the space where of household goods, right, where consumers nowadays are very keen about how sustainable your product is, right? So these can have impacts on your business decisions, right, your product developments. And finally, the other things, the market and other transition related things. So market risk basically, kind of screws up the pricing, right? The supply and demand goes for a toss and the pricing goes for a toss, right? So that's what the our Indian government is fighting against for the proposed, CBAM, right? Cross-border adjustment mechanism that the EU has proposed, so that the playing field is level. But this could impact our exporters when we are faced with some additional taxes for us not being clean, for our products not being very less intensive. So which could make our products not very competitive on a global scale, right? Apart from that, we also have supply chain constraints, right? Because everybody is trying to move towards greener technologies, and the raw materials needed for that, they are at a constraint. Especially China being a big player in the rare earth material space, they just recently said that they're going to do a ban, right? So once that happens, yeah, our EV industry, they are already facing the crunch, right? So we don't have the capacity in India, within India, right, to build all these batteries, and we don't have the capacity of getting this raw material, right? So we are already facing the brunt of it. So these are all the risks apart from the physical risks what we saw that businesses are most likely to face going forward. So the question next comes is, how are you going to manage it, right? So obviously not everything can be mitigated, you can only be best prepared to manage it. So next slide please. So managing starts by measuring your emissions, right? Like where do you stand right now? What are your emissions, right? How much you're emitting? So you need to build that inventory so that you would be in a position to understand your potential exposures and vulnerabilities, right? Say for example, I'm in a energy sector and I have a legacy asset that just emits a lot of carbon and methane. I'm already exposed to it, right? Or I'm a supplier to let's say to an automotive manufacturer who has only diesel power trains. So that guy is exposed. So because of his exposure, I'm also exposed, because once he tries to move on to an alternate technology, if I'm not in the alternate technology of maybe the hybrids or the EV, then I'm going to lose my business, right? So that's my exposure. And my vulnerability is how quickly I'm able to transition myself, right? So my legacy asset could be very highly emitting, but then if I can retrofit it, or if I can bring down the emissions, then my vulnerability goes down to some extent. So all these comes up once we set up, or once we determine where do we stand, what's our inventory levels at. So how do we measure about, how do we go on about measuring it, right? So there are two major methodologies that are available in the world right now. So one is GHG protocols corporate standard, which allows for companies to come up with their own inventories. So they have split their emissions, or they are categorizing their emissions in three different ways: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. I think some of you might be aware of these terminologies, right? Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions, right? So Scope 1 emission is predominantly the emissions from the assets that you own, that comes from because of your direct business operations. So Scope 2 emissions is all emission that's come from you purchasing electricity, and also the other kind of energy like heating and cooling. So heating and cooling might not be really a thing in Indian context. So predominantly it could be just electricity for us. So that is Scope 2. And Scope 3, all other emissions, either be it upstream, downstream, right? So whatever your suppliers are emitting in during their transmit, or whatever your consumers are emitting when they are consuming your product, right? For example, right, I'm a oil refinery firm, so my predominant emissions come from Scope 3, right? So whenever I sell the oil that I refined, so someone's going to burn it in their car or their two-wheeler. So that's when the emissions going to become my problem. So it's not I'm my major chunk does not really come from the assets that I own, but because of the usage of my sold products, right? So that's Scope 3 emissions. So in general, companies prefer following GHG protocol, because GHG protocol is built for comparisons, right? And also it's very prescriptive, right? They really get down to the details to explain how you measure this thing. And if you are not sure what to do about it, how can you substitute it, right? Because we always don't have first-hand data about certain emissions, right? It's really difficult to track emissions. So they come up with emissions factors which you can use based on your sector or based on the activity you're talking about, and come up with a factor and then calculate it. So for that reason, companies around the world prefer GHG protocol. And SBTI, right, Science Based Target Initiative, wants you to set your targets based on GHG protocol standards. So for these two reasons, companies prefer using GHG protocol. But we also have ISO 14064-1. So they also categorize the emission in the same way what GHG does. It's just a different naming convention. So direct emission is equivalent of Scope 1, energy indirect emission is equivalent of Scope 2, and the third final one is the equivalent of Scope 3, right? Uh, okay. So yeah, Nitin. So okay, can I wrap up in a minute? Okay. uh, I'll need 5 more minutes, Nitin. I'm really sorry. I'll just wrap it as early as possible, right? So once your inventory is there, so next step, please. Next slide, please. So that once your inventory is there, then you need to bring about targets, right? You need to set targets. One, it's not only adequate that you know what your current stand is, you also need to have proper target as to how you're going to do reduce it, right? Because that's what is required. And usually companies follow this target guidance given by SBTA, Science Based Target Initiative. So their elements is you need to have a near-term target, which is like 5 to 10 years, and your long-term target, which is should be aligning with 2050. But India as a country does not have a net zero target for 2050. So it is okay for Indian firms to have a target around 2070. And also after you reach your long-term target, you need to also have neutralization of residual emissions, right? Because not everybody can go 100% zero emissions, right? So you need to have some negative emissions which you pull out of the air through various mechanisms. So that's the next step. Moving forward. Next slide, please. So yeah, so next comes the scenario analysis. So once you have determined your target, you need to analyze how aligned you are with your national target or your sector target, right? So the more misaligned you are, the more steeper you need to reduce your emissions. Apart from that, the suppliers in Pune, right? So they have retrofitted some old motors what they used in their manufacturing process, which have helped them save, a decent amount of sum for them, right? So the first other benefit will be energy and cost savings. So moving on, next one. So yeah, so the next one, I think we skipped a slide, I guess. Could you please go back? Yeah, global markets. This is a big thing, right? As SMEs, we rely more on exports too, right? We are already seeing what the global tariffs could do to us. So imagine a place scenario along with the tariffs where CBAM is there and your importer wants you to have a decarbonization certificate, right? Your business goes for a toss completely, right? So you can't that's a very uncertain world that you don't want to be in. So decarbonization and all these activities helps you to get a competitive advantage to better global markets. Your suppliers rely on you more, they want more from you, so that helps you to stay ahead of competition. So let's move on the next benefit. So better access to finance and green loans, right? So throughout the world, investors are looking for opportunities that are more cleaner, that fulfill their ESG tick boxes, because as much as there is decarbonization laws, there's also finance laws which prevents companies to invest in not so clean businesses anymore. So finance companies are looking for avenues where they can invest and where they can bring a better return for their investors. So when your business is decarbonized and you are a cleaner business, you get better access to finances, you get a better credit rating, which will help you in the long run. So that's the next benefit. So moving on, next one. So clearly the next one is reputation branding, right? So a firm that has taken accountability, that has clearly stated its intention to clean its own emissions, right? So that is a very trustworthy firm for stakeholders, right? All the stakeholders, either be it your investors or your customers, your clients or your partners, whoever it might be, your reputation goes up in their eyes. So you become more significant to them, so they continue having businesses with you. So that's the next one. And the final benefit would be, next slide please. Okay, so innovation and product expansion, right? So this transition to greener energy and low carbon economy, that instills innovation, right? So what are innovation? We didn't see many of the innovation, especially in solar and wind farming, right? So earlier the cost used to be ridiculously high, which made coal-fired power plants to be very economically viable. But the cost of solar panels or lithium-ion batteries, everything is going down as we move towards a greener economy. So this is sprucing up innovation, where companies are also coming up with low carbon ideas, pitching their products, that becomes more appealing to a wider audience, especially the global audience. So this is a final benefit. So these are all the benefits. So to summarize, climate change is here and it's going to stay for a long time, and countries are transitioning. So not only the physical effects are going to take a toll on businesses, but also the transition brings unprecedented, unshaky, very shakeful moments, right? So we need to be prepared. So yeah, Nitin, I'm sorted. So we can go for the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start off. I'll wait for some more questions that is
Okay.
coming from our friends here. So yeah, thank you, Anand. That was quite an interesting and amazing topic. So I'll take the role of an MSME. All right, an
Yeah.
MSME who's probably uh, doing about 50 CR turnover, who's probably operating out of a industrial area. We have a lot of these industrial parks. So he's operating out of industrial area where there are a lot of his neighbors are also having these things. Now, if this particular owner, let us say
Hmm.
X, is aware of the importance of climate change, the second generation, and tells him that we must do it. So, how
Hmm.
do you address the thought process or the hesitation? Okay, I will do, but my neighbor is spewing, all the smoke and everything here. Me alone doing it, how will it help? Are there any litigations or rules in place? I'm sorry, rules and regulations in place that will ensure everybody in the area does it. Only I'm keeping my house clean, but everybody else is doing it. So how does it really affect? So that is something that is. How would you answer that if we were to approach an MSME to take up, carbon emission reduction projects?
Yeah, this is a very prevalent problem, not only for MSMEs, right? Even for countries, right? So let's take a bigger country. Why would I want to decarbonize myself when the other countries are still emitting, right? So it's a question of common good. So it's a it's a question that the economists are trying to grapple with. So who takes the bite, right? Why should I do it? So to answer your question, that's why governments are bringing up policies, forcing businesses their hands to do this. So on top of that, other than government forces, I think as a business to survive, right, moving forward, how much ever the pace at which the transition is happening, it is happening, right? It's a rolling ball. Maybe the pace of the ball is slow at this point, but it's gonna happen at a rapid rate because it's an inevitable thing, right? So if we don't stay ahead of the curve, we are going to lose business. As simple as that, right? So if you don't say I'm a supplier for foreign countries, right? If my importer does not want my product anymore because I'm not clean with my emissions, then I'm losing out, right? So my simple pitch to the MSMEs would be, beyond the fact to do greater good for the environment or for world as a whole, it allows you to stand out as a business, right? It allows you to gain an advantage, like we saw, right? Which could be bit, upfront cost could be a bit higher, but on the long run that's going to be beneficial, right? It's going to help them, to get better returns, to do more cost saving, and probably stay longer in the game. So probably this would be my pitch to an MSME who's a bit hesitant. I'll try to convince them, saying that there is a bigger picture beyond just doing good. Okay, maybe you might win it eventually. Yeah.
Just a
Nitin, you are.
conversation. Probably what I would probably sell them is
Hmm.
the financial benefits, like you mentioned, better loans and things like that. I'll probably bring in that first for an MSME. But that's why I brought in a 50 crore company, which profitability is important. So I'll probably bring in that aspect first. That if you are working towards net zero or reduction of carbon emissions, and if you have these numbers put in place, A,
Hmm.
B, C, D are the things that you stand to benefit. And we can work out a timeline wherein we can assist you with the reduction of your carbon emissions over a period of time, which eventually will translate to the benefits, like I said, A, B, C, D, whether it is a
Hmm.
better credit facility or a loan or visibility or international customers. Now, if you're dealing with probably customers from the Europe, which is generally more compliant towards emission norms. So probably
Yeah,
you can say that I'm also somebody who's on those lines. So probably I would approach it from that perspective.
from the
I
finance
guess,
perspective.
yeah, I'll probably. Yes. So friends, questions, please.
Anand, I have one question. So,
Yeah.
how can SMEs start measuring their carbon footprint if they don't have resources like that of big companies?
Well, okay. So that's a very valid question, right? So SMEs, as it is, like Nitin mentioned, that you need to target them with finance being the important factor.
Mm.
So it's always the cost and benefit for them, right? Like what do I get out of it? So they can't spend too much on it. So we have different levels at which you measure emissions, right? You can get as detailed as possible, or you just stick with your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, right? So you measuring your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions is a bit straightforward. Your scope 3 emissions are much difficult to measure.
Mhm.
So like you said, they don't have data, right? So what do you do? So that's where GHG protocol has come up with this idea of giving coming up with activity factors, right? So say for example, um, I have a generator. Okay, so there is a activity factor for the generator that GHG has said. Okay, for a generator of this capacity, this is what they emit on an average. So we take
Mm.
that average figure and then we extrapolate it for a firm, right, based on their size of generators that they have. So that's what you do. So you don't always need to have first-hand data. Actually, even the bigger firms don't have first-hand data, so they
Okay.
rely really on this activity factors that GHG protocol has come up, and they have actually done a very good job at it because they have also made factors for the Indian context too, not just for the European and the US market. They also have factors that is very specific for Indian markets and Indian sectors. So using that thing, you'll come at a ballpark figure, right? It might not be exactly what you're emitting, but somewhere in the region. So that's how you go on about it. And for an SME, I would recommend that focus on your scope 1 and scope 2 first. That's much more easy. Even SBTI recommends you to first doing that. Okay, SBTI, even though they have their own corporate standard, they also have a SME version where they have become a bit lenient on what's expected from SME. So I think that's how you go on about Akhil.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Anand.
Yeah.
So I have a question. This is with reference to when we approach an MSME and keeping you as the brand ambassador, Anand, that we have this person, an expert who can help you in reduction of your carbon emissions, which will eventually translate to so many benefits, etc. Uh, what would be probably your first steps as an expert in an organization? Typically, would it be like you get into a detailed kind of an engagement? Because I want our MSME friends to understand how this engagement would be, what would be the duration, what kind of touch points would the expert have with the organization, a time of study, and also kind of a ballpark of what would be the cost involved for undergoing this kind of a project, which they cannot really see the benefits immediately. But even if they do get convinced, what will be?
Okay, all right. So the initial step would be to trace your entire business line, right? The chain, where you start and where you end. The cradle to grave chain, right? So you just dot it out, like see what are all involved, what all you own, what all you rely on your partners for. So you segregate it, right? You build boundaries, like so so that's where I would start. That's where any emission inventory practice starts. First you build a boundary, determine what are you going to include in first, right? So that inclusion could be as far reaching as uh, right from where my raw material extracted till my product goes into the garbage can, right? It could be that elaborate, or it could be as small as right from the raw material reached my premise and the moment it leaves my premise, right? So there are multiple levels of boundaries that businesses can play with. And like I said for Akhil's questions, right? So predominantly business start with scope 1 and scope 2, because usually that boundary is much smaller, because mostly it's all your assets, what you own, and the electricity that you get from outside. So it's a much more straightforward thing. So probably that sort of an engagement requires to understand what assets the businesses have, how much probably what could then build a boundary around it, basically, to start with. So once that is in place, then you determine what sort of an approach you're going to do, because the approach also matters. So different approach will give you different emissions figures, right? So the approach matters. So based on that approach, we'll decide whether to consider an asset in your scope or a different company scope, right? Because you could have just leased an asset. You're not an owner of the asset. So based on the approach, that asset might not be included in your scope. Okay, it becomes a scope for somebody else. So this practice starts there, building your boundary and building the approach. So once it is done, for SMEs, I would recommend start with just scope 1, scope 2. So that could be a very small engagement, probably a 2 to 3 month engagement, not more than that. Because most SMEs, probably they are small scale, so they have factories, and they so predominantly their emissions are going to come from there. That's what their biggest asset would be. And the next thing would be the electricity that they get from, so we have different ways to measure emissions from electricity. So I don't think an engagement should be more than 2 to 3 months for an SME, especially if you're just focusing on scope 1 and scope 2 thing. And going for the cost aspect, uh, I mean, so it all boils down.
I'm talking about the cost of implementation. I'm not talking
Hmm.
about the cost of consultation. So you make some changes, you recommend something. So to modify their equipment or make it more energy efficient or things like that, would you be able to beforehand. No? You don't have to give me the cost. What I'm saying is, as part of your pitch, would you be able to tell them that if you were to spend so much money towards, I have seen your equipments, I have seen your the energy audits or all that I have done. So if you spend so much money towards uh, making these changes, you will be primarily saving in terms of the amount of electricity usage, and also that will affect things like that. So would you be,
Mhm.
as part of your initial assessment, be able to tell them, give the MSMEs about where I'm coming from is they are very, very keen about knowing how much I have to spend and what benefit I get. Now we are not very clear with the MSME in this kind of scenario what benefit we are giving them, because they're looking at financial benefits. We're going to tell them something else. If we are not clear about what they are going to be spending in terms
Mhm.
of this thing, so will that be something that we could will be able to provide, is my question, not the
Yes.
cost of consultancy.
Yes, we will be able to provide that. So once we complete this exercise of building an inventory, so we will be able to figure out what are the low hanging fruits, right? The ones which does not really require lots of cost input, maybe a minimal amount, but the returns in terms of emission savings, right? That could be a bit higher. So this inventory that we come up, so we can actually segregate, what are your top three emissions, where do you emit a lot, and what will be the cost of doing that, right? uh, Say for example, you have a manufacturing line, okay, and that line, emits, let's say, so much of energy because your heat conversion process is not efficient. So how would you go on about replacing that fossil fuel based heat to a greener energy, right? So then that becomes like a business decision, right? So we give alternatives, right? So you have this, and the cost of this is this, and probably this is the benefit you're going to get out of it, right? So that discussion needs to happen, right? So as a consultant, I'll be able to propose various things. So based on the convenient factor of the client, so they can go ahead with what suits their business most, right? So there could be an option where they have to, spend a lot of money on it, but then the return would be spread across multiple periods. But there could be also a scenario where you really don't have to change the entire thing. Maybe you might need to just retrofit something, and that could have a shorter lifespan, but the benefit and the initial outlay that you do is not really ridiculously high for you, so that you say, no boss, I don't want to do it at all, right? So that alternate pitching, the cost benefit comes only when we do this analysis of how things are happening. Based on that, we will be able to find out what alternatives are there, and then we can have a discussion, right? These are the alternatives, pick what suits you, or I can recommend this what suits you based on your needs, right? And it's also very sector specific, right? Not all sectors are in the limelight, because not all sectors emit equally, right? Some sectors are really highly emitting, some sectors are not really highly emitting. So the entire focus is on those high sectors now. So probably a smaller SME, might not be even interested in doing all this, right? As a SME who does not really emit a lot, whereas a SME who emits a lot, let's say, who's in the leather industry or who's in the textile industry, right? So for them, it becomes a cost benefit analysis based on where they stand. So I hope I answered your question.
So typically, what we also do with experts, other experts who get into
Mm.
engagement, is we many times have it in a two-phase kind of engagement. The first phase of the engagement is kind of what we call a gap study, where we try to understand what the expert is getting into, and
Mm.
and whether the expert will be able to deliver, and what the expert is promising, and what the MSME can expect out of the engagement. Again, that is a short study, that what you said, the cradle to grave study that you said. So the complete study they will do, and then give kind of a roadmap that in the first 3 months, first 6 months, first 12 months, this is what uh, you will be doing. Which, if you put it in a tabular column, what we'll do, how much it'll cost you, what benefit you'll get, in a
Mm.
simple kind of oversimplifying it. So that is what we propose, and then the MSME decides to pick up the entire thing or part of it or things like that. So that was the reason why I was, coming with that question. So yeah, I think you've adequately answered. So any more questions, friends? All right. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Anand. That was a great interaction. So we'll be continuously in touch with you. And then if there are certain other queries that our MSME friends have, which we'd like to take offline and probably, discuss with you and
Sure,
try to
sure.
address
That's
their
good.
concerns, we'll be reaching out to you.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
once
please do.
again, thank you for your time, and we'll keep interacting again. Thank you,
Yeah,
audience, for coming in, and also apologies for that small hitch in between. Thank you so much.
yeah, thanks a lot, Nitin. Thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Thank you all. Thank you all for attending. Have a good day.